Usability, examining audience and purpose. If you think about usable documents, there are several characteristics of a usable document. The first is that the information can be located easily, information can be understood immediately, and information can be used safely and successfully. So in other words, what we want to do is when we create documents is to think of the end user and not ourselves. So there are some steps in preparing a usable document. The first is to analyze the document's audience. Who will be reading it and who is our primary audience, who is our secondary audience. It's something I will be talking about a little bit more in slides to come. You also want to determine the document's purpose. What are you trying to do with your document? Often you want to create a task analysis for the document. You should consider the setting, potential problems, length, format, timing, and the budget. You also want to develop an information plan for the document. And then finally, you should write, test, and revise the document. So you talk about analyzing a document's audience. There's some questions you should ask to better understand your audience. Who is the main audience for this document? Who else is likely to read it? And what is your relationship with the audience? Are there multiple types of relationships? When you talk about relationships, if you are a trainer and you write a training document, your relationship might be with people who are in management, people who are workers on the floor, and people who are engineers. Going along with that, you might think about how familiar the audience is with technical details. Once again, if you're writing to a group of engineers, their technical savvy is a lot greater than if it's an end user client, oftentimes. You also want to think about what culture does your audience represent. And finally, what media format is best for the particular audience that you are writing to. When you talk about audiences, there are primary and there are secondary audiences. The primary audience is the immediate audience to which the document is geared. Secondary audiences, those outside the immediate circle of people who will be needing the information directly. A good example, if you think of something like work instructions, the immediate audience might be the people who are working directly on whatever they are creating. A secondary audience might be engineering. When you think about your relationship to the audience, it dictates the level of formality to use, level of confidentiality, the level of persuasion, and the level of even-handedness to use. In other words, you have to think about what your purpose is relative to the audience and how you interact with that audience. As mentioned earlier, a very important thing to consider is the audience's technical background. The words and images should be easily understood by the audience. You want to avoid jargon when writing for a broad audience, and you should consider levels of expertise and language differences. Generally speaking, if you're writing documents, you want to have language that is simple as possible, and even if you have a technical audience, eliminate as much jargon as possible in order to make the document clear. You also want to consider an audience's cultural background. Information needs and preferences are often determined by culture, and cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings. So for example, I used to work in industry and we had a lot of interaction with our Japanese portion of our company. The way that the Japanese culture works and the way that the American culture works are two different things. It's very important to understand that when you write documents that you appreciate these cultural differences so that everything is understood. Some strategies for analyzing your audience. You need to picture what readers need and expect. So a very important thing with audience analysis is be able to put yourself in the shoes of other people. A very common error that people make is they assume that people know what they know, and that's not always the case. Once again, you want to identify your primary and secondary audiences, your relationship, and their technical and cultural background. picture the general reader when the audience is unknown. You should anticipate readers' questions and recognize that audiences are not merely passive recipients of information. In other words, they have their own thoughts, feelings, preconceptions, all these things, and you need to take those into account. So a couple of questions, or a few questions to ask to determine document's purpose. What's the main purpose of the document? What are you trying to do? What other purpose or purposes does the document serve? And what will readers do with this information? If your main purpose is to create instructions to put together a tricycle, right? You have to think about what the readers know and what they'll do with this information. It should be simple, there should be pictures, it should be obvious. If you think about primary and secondary purposes, they might be to inform, to instruct, to persuade, or to write a comprehensive purpose statement. So it's important to know how the audience will use the document. In addition to pondering it yourself, you can ask members of the audience directly. So a good example is if you create work instructions for factory workers and they're putting together servers, for example, you know how they're going to use it, at least at a high level, but it's important for you to ask them, to have them run through your instructions so that you really understand how they will be going to using it on a daily basis. Sometimes you need to be persuasive with documentation, and what you need to do is set the stage for the persuasive appeal. There are many types of claims, what facts are, what facts means, and what should be done with these facts. Claims must be supported by factual information. Facts can be tricky because we all have personal biases, and particularly if we're trying to be persuasive. But facts should be unbiased. Frankly speaking, if you can't support your claim with facts or unbiased facts, perhaps you should not be making it. When you talk about persuasion, you have to connect with your audience. There are many ways to do this. There's a power connection. You can get audience to comply with your message, which sometimes works. Relationship, which is probably the best one, or one of the better ones, is to get the audience to identify with your message. And the last one might be a rational connection. Get audience to internalize what you say. In other words, set forth the facts and get the audience to understand these facts and to believe these facts. More strategies of persuasion. You want to identify your specific goal, anticipate reaction, allow for give and take, and recognize certain constraints. Once again, always consider a cultural context. Choose the right time and the right medium, and then also find a way to connect with your audience. Relationships are very important when you talk about persuasion. You can also create a task analysis for your document. So when you create a task analysis, some things you do, you define the main tasks, obviously. You add your subtasks, and it's especially important when there are several tasks. Now, when you think about a task analysis, a really good way to think about this is an outline that details the process that you're going to document. So in other words, it takes into consideration things like audience, purpose, and then how those things are interwoven with what you're trying to accomplish. So here's an example sample task analysis for an instructional manual. The task, assemble the grill. Main task is use the grill, and you can see the subtasks beneath them. And then, of course, maintaining the grill is important. Otherwise, you have to buy a new grill. There's other related usability factors. A setting, determine where your document will be used. If you think about the grill, the document's going to be used, the guy's going to be, or the woman is going to be putting together the grill on the deck. Wind's blowing, they have their document. You want to have pictures that are crystal clear and have as few steps and as clear steps as possible. You anticipate all the things that might go wrong. Once again, if, for example, having put together a grill, if we use that example, if the pictures don't align with the parts that come with the grill set, it creates a problem. And you also want to think about length. You want to decide an acceptable length that makes the document most accessible. Of course, there are other factors considered, when you have to work with engineering to say how can we make this as simple as possible in as few steps as possible. But once again, speaking relatively obviously, simple is always the better way to go. Other related usability factors, you want to think about format. You want to find the appropriate balance between visuals and text. As I said, it's important to have, oftentimes important to have visuals, but the text needs to be to relate very well with those visuals and to provide enough information so that you can fill in the blanks that are not covered by the visuals. And then you also think about if you're working in a corporate context, due dates, and then of course budget. So ways to cut down costs are always soft factors that you have to think about. You also can develop an information plan for your document. Components, you want to think about a concise purpose statement. If you think about any time that you write anything in English, you have to have a thesis, and that's what a purpose statement is. Here's why we're doing it. And more information might be setting, potential problems, length, format, timing, budget. There's a sample information plan for the Grill Chef Corporation. As you can see, there's a primary audience. There's some audience analysis in there. The purpose is laid out. There's a task analysis, which we saw in previous slides. And then part 2, there's design plans based on the above analysis. In other words, how are we going to do this based on who we think our audience is and what our purpose is. And then, of course, on the bottom, there's the production schedule. One of the last things that we talk about is writing, testing, revising, and proofreading the document. So when you assess a document's usability, you want to think about the content, how it's organized, the style, the layout and visuals, and then when you talk to your lawyer about ethical, legal, and cultural considerations. The biggest thing I would say is that things need to be clear, they need to be concise, and they need to be organized in a way that the psychology of your reader will understand it. And so, in other words, and a good example of this actually is the textbook for the class. The textbook for the class is set out in a way where the content is organized and very well, and stylistically it makes sense. They utilize visuals very well, so it's easy to read, easy to comprehend. Last thing I talk about is proofreading. Proofreading is very important. Obviously, you don't want to make mistakes. And you think about things like sentence, punctuation, usage, mechanical errors, formatting errors, typographical errors. All should be relatively obvious. Some strategies for proofreading. You want to save it to the final draft. It says take a break before proofreading your final document, which is always a good idea. You put it away, you come back and look at it. Generally speaking, you want to work from a hard copy. Take your time. Proofread more than once, and it says never rely only on autocorrect. However, I would say that if you use technology, for example, Microsoft Word, a lot of other applications have ways to spell check, grammar check. You should use those. One thing additionally is if you have other people around who understand what you're trying to do, it's a good idea to have someone else look at it as well.